I did prepare some slides, but it was for a different talk than the one I'm going to give, so you can get rid of the slides. What I really want to do in this talk is to give you some idea of what I have learned in my life that I think have lessons for everybody. There's several things. We all go to school, we go to university. Do you want to take the slides off? Just get rid of them. You learn a lot at school, you learn a lot at university, you learn a lot of basic skills, but the things that really stand out to the people who are going to be successful is that they do things that they have been motivated to do. And the inspiration typically comes from within, it doesn't come from outside. And I think I learned very early on that it was important to find mentors, people that you could learn from, people who would value you. And this started for me when I was 8 years of age. I went to a school in England, and at the end of the day, the headmaster used to give me little puzzles to do, little mathematical puzzles. And I would go home, and I just loved these. I fell in love with mathematics because the headmaster had given me some puzzles. That turned out to really lay a foundation for my work over the years. I learned lots of math at school, but puzzles, games, this is the thing that's always fascinated me. A little later, my father bought me a chemistry set, and so I got involved in doing chemistry at home. And that led me to want to go to school to learn more chemistry. I ended up going to Sheffield University, learning how to do chemistry. Again, when I was in Sheffield University as an undergraduate, I took all the courses. Some were good, some were not so good, but I learned some basic skills, enough skills to learn how to think as a scientist. I think at a skills university, you learn how to think about a wide range of things. You take courses in different things. But ultimately, it is the thing that you become passionate about that you're going to succeed at. If all you do is listen to what other people have to say to you and don't have some inner spark that you allow to grow, then you will be in trouble. When I was at Sheffield University as an undergraduate, I didn't really have anybody who I would consider a mentor, but there was one of the professors, actually the head of department, he was professor of organic chemistry, and he taught in a very interesting way. He taught in a way that I think many university professors, many teachers could learn from. And that is, these days, we want to look for answers to things. We go to Google. Go to Google, ask a question, and Google will give you the answer. I can tell you the exams that my organic professors set, Google could not have answered the questions, because it depended on so much more than just reiterating facts that you'd been presented with. And I went to work for him as a graduate student to get my PhD, but I didn't see much of him. I actually was put in a lab, and there was a Japanese postdoc who was there. And I would say I learned more chemistry from this man, Kazu Kurosawa, his name. He was fantastic. He was one of these people who will tell you how to do something, will teach you why you're doing it, and then whether it fails or whether it works, he was able to teach you how to analyze things properly, how to do a post-mortem if things fail. And I think this is something we really need to teach students, that not everything is perfect. Very often you will do something, you think it's going to be really good, but it actually fails and doesn't work. And so what do? Do you give up? Maybe if you're a kid, your parents say, oh, you're no good because you kept failing at this, that, and the other, or maybe a teacher will tell you that. But I think failure is really one of the very best teaching lessons that one has. But not just to fail, but to do the post-mortem and find out why you failed. A good example of this is if you travel on an aircraft, this is probably the safest form of transportation out there. And why is that? Well, it's because every time there is an accident, the aircraft industry does a massive post-mortem to find out what went wrong. It would be nice if doctors did the same thing, but they tend not to. Might be nice if politicians did the same thing too, but that's a separate story. But failure is inherently a good thing. I won the Nobel Prize because I devised a very clever experiment. It didn't work. We got a result. I had a postdoc working with me, and he did the experiment, and 3 times it didn't work. And I said, let me do it. I will show you how to do it. And it didn't work for me either. And at this point, we knew that the failure was not because of us, but because nature was trying to tell us something, that the way we thought things worked really didn't work. We spent probably the best part of 2 years trying to figure out why the experiment failed, and the bottom line, we discovered that genes in higher organisms were very different from genes in bacteria, and that led to the Nobel Prize, which was a good thing. I have to say, I'll tell you a little more about that later, but there are many things that come from that. Now, after I got my PhD, I applied to, well, I'd read a book and I decided I didn't want to do chemistry, I wanted to do molecular biology because it looked far more interesting. I applied to 6 places to go and do a postdoc. 5 of them turned me down, 1 took me. And the one who took me was a professor who was at Wisconsin in the USA. And about 2 months before I had to go, he called me and he said, can you just delay for 2 months because I'm about to go to Harvard. He'd just been appointed a tenured professor at Harvard, and so I ended up at Harvard. And this illustrates something else that is incredibly important, and I think everybody can learn from this, and that is I went to Harvard by a stroke of luck, not because I applied to go there, but just by a stroke of luck. And I think if we look back on our lives, we discover that luck is incredibly important. You don't always appreciate it at the time, but when it does come, a lesson I learned very early on playing snooker from an old gentleman, he said, well, you know, you play a shot and you get a lucky break, you have to focus twice as hard the next time around to make sure that you don't waste the luck that came. Everybody has luck. Don't feel guilty about it. Take the most of it, make the most of it. Focus twice as hard going forward. And so that was a lesson I learned at Harvard, that I got there by luck, but I really made the most of it. I spent some time at the MRC lab in Cambridge learning a technique from a Nobel Prize winner, Fred Sanger. He'd already won Nobel Prize, he went and won a second, one of only 4 people who've actually won 2 Nobel Prizes. And he was fantastic. He was a very humble man. When I first met him, he was washing glassware in his lab, and I thought he was the janitor. And I said, you know, I'm Rich Roberts, I've come here to work with Fred Sanger, and he said, oh, I'm Fred Sanger. Wonderful introduction to someone, and this was just the sort of person he was. If I had someone that I wanted to aspire to emulate, it would be Fred Sanger. Very humble, very focused on what he was doing, and very keen to help other people. So that was important. When I left Harvard, I went to a laboratory called Cold Spring Harbor on Long Island, and the head of the lab was a man called Jim Watson. Watson and Crick discovered the structure of DNA, the double helix of DNA, a very famous man. When I got there, I'd been hired to do a project that I discovered there were 2 other labs doing. And I've hated this sort of competition, just trying to do something that other people are doing. I like to do things where people will say, oh, that was a good idea, because they hadn't thought of it themselves. And so when I got to Cold Spring Harbor, instead of doing the project that Jim Watson had hired me for, I started on something totally different, and that was looking and isolating some enzymes called restriction enzymes that could cut DNA at very specific places. That, at the time, turned out to be an incredible choice. There were loads of these things. These enzymes formed the basis of the biotechnology industry. I think you're all aware that biotechnology is a pretty big thing. Recombinant DNA all came because restriction enzymes were available. I actually got involved with a company. I met a man called Don Combe, who had a small company up in Boston, and they had been making reagents for research, and he had thought perhaps one of these restriction enzymes would be something he could sell. I heard about him, I called him up, and I said, well, I've got 30 of these things. You should sell all of them. I'll tell you how to make them. I'll give you the strains so you can do it yourself. And he said, that sounds great. Would you become a partner in the business? Well, I wasn't actually interested in becoming a partner in the business, and again, that was probably a good choice. I said, I'll be your chief consultant, but I'd rather go back to Cold Spring Harbor, do my research, and of course, ultimately, that led to the Nobel Prize. So that was a good path to take. Again, if you like, a lucky break, but it was because I have never had a basic interest in money. I'm rather different from a lot of people. I like to do what I like to do. I like to do what I love. I like to be passionate about things. And I love people, students, when they come to me and they say, oh, I really want to do this. This is the thing I'm really passionate about. And I think this is something else that is very useful when teaching students, not to say, well, you've got to get grade A in this, and this, but to say, what is it you're passionate about, and do the very best you can. Because people who are passionate and are smart, they'll get a job that's not really a job, it's their hobby. They like to do it. My wife thinks I work. I don't think I work. I think I'm just pursuing my hobby, and I have a great life and a great time because of it. So that was at Cold Spring Harbor. I used to fight with Jim Watson all the time, but I stayed there for 20 years. And then when it came time to leave, I decided that I would go and join New England Biolabs. They made me an extremely good offer to go and work up there. Went and worked up there, and then the following year, I won the Nobel Prize. And I learned something very valuable from the Nobel Prize. I've always been fairly outspoken. I sort of tell people what I think. And if I think they're doing something stupid, I usually tell them so. And of course, that doesn't always work as well as you might like. But on the whole, I find honesty and following facts and talking facts is a good thing. And so before I won the Nobel Prize, I would give talks like this. I'd talk to all sorts of people. And sometimes they'd listen politely, but most of the time they would never do anything about it. After I won the Nobel Prize, I realized that people like you in this audience all of a sudden listen to me. And sometimes you even act on the things that I say. And I found this to be an extraordinary experience. And so one of the things I've tried to do is to use the pulpit, the bully pulpit that I have as a Nobel Prize winner, to try and do good things. And the areas that I try to focus on are humanitarian things, things that will help humanity, and then debunking science that is bad. I got involved in getting the release of some nurses from prison in Bulgaria. In Libya, rather. They'd been accused of spreading HIV in the children's hospital. And it was clear it was not them. It was bad hospital practices that they'd been taught there. But Gaddafi decided that they had to be executed. And they were on death row. And I heard about this. I went down and talked to the Libyan ambassador to the UN. And I pointed out that the science really said this was not what was going on. I gave him a letter. I said, would you pass this to Mr. Gaddafi? 2 weeks later, I got a call from Gaddafi's son, Saif al-Islam. He said, would you come to Tripoli and talk to us about this? Can you imagine that? Can you imagine you talking to Gaddafi and then all of a sudden he says, oh, come visit me, come talk to me. I was overwhelmed. But the bottom line was, by the time we finished talking, he said, well, we know that they're not guilty, we're going to let them go. And so we managed to get that done. Most recently, I've been heavily involved in a campaign to counteract the misleading, false science about genetically modified organisms. Okay? GMOs are probably the safest advance that we've made in agriculture in many, many years. And yet, if you listen You hear that all people will say, oh, they're dangerous. We don't know how bad they could be. You listen to Vandana Shiva. She just lies about this. And why does she do it? Well, I guess it's to get good speaking fees or something. I don't know why. But it's had a very deleterious effect. The Europeans politicized this whole business. Greenpeace came out, and they did it in order to raise money and to get some political capital out of it. And this is just awful. You know, we have more than 30 years now of science behind GMOs and everything that says that they're good. I heard just last week that GM mustard had been approved here in India. This is a huge advance. I had spoken to Prime Minister Modi a few years ago on a couple of occasions, and he listened, but I didn't really think he'd done anything. Hopefully, this is an example of what he is going to do and going to back. BT cotton has been incredibly successful here in India. And so I want to leave you with the thought that it is good to do two things. It's very good to learn the basic skills, but it's probably more important to find the thing you love to do, pursue it, make a career out of it, and if you can be an activist, then please be an activist. Don't let people walk all over you. Thank you.